Elise Bialylew from Mindful in May. Welcome to the Future Proof Couch.
Glad to be here.
I want to have a chat with you today to get your perspectives as an expert, not only on mindfulness, but now on happiness off the back of your new book, The Happiness Plan. I'd love to hear your perspectives on what has got you excited about the future.
So the past, let's say 15 years, I've been very immersed in the brain, the mind and meditation.
Yep.
And it's been an incredibly exciting field to be involved in because there's been such a huge momentum in the science around this field. And I think what I'm most excited about is just the exponential amount of research coming out, which is showing us how the power of meditation can actually not only transform our biology, our blood pressure, reduce our stress levels, but actually transform the brain as well. And I think that the way I see this is that because of all of the other developments in technology and the challenges we face, we really need to, as I say, upgrade our inner technology to keep up with the outer technology developments. And that's really what I see meditation as being able to offer us.
I love that term, inner technology. So are you familiar at all with the work of Cal Newport and his thinking around deep work?
I haven't read his book,
Yep.
but yes.
Okay, and so I'd love to hear your perspectives because I've become really interested in neuroplasticity and the ability to be able to change the brain, through practice or building muscles around doing certain things repetitively in order to hopefully make it better, not worse. So Cal talks about the ability to do deep focus work and how it's critical for the future, but he also talks about how we have programmed ourselves and our neural pathways to be nothing but in a constant state of distraction. Yeah, and this is impacting our ability to do the deep focus work. What's sort of your take on that based on what you know about how the brain works, and are you seeing evidence of this through the work that you're doing?
Yes, so I would say that what's really interesting about neuroplasticity, which people don't often emphasize, is that the brain changes no matter what we're doing with it. And so this has positive and negative effects. So Michael Merzenich, who's one of the neuroscientists that featured in the Mindful in May program, he shared some really fascinating research, which is this idea that he says in his talk that he could take your right hand and with the right training make it completely useless. So the neuroplasticity, that's why it's so important that we take charge and we take responsibility for what we're actually doing from minute to minute, what we're doing in our lives, because if we don't, then the environment is going to be master of that. And that's going to have deleterious effects because it's molding our brains towards the chaos and the fragmentation of our environment. So I think that's a really interesting point that often doesn't get emphasized when we talk about neuroplasticity. So it's not just that your mind is like default and then you can make it better through repetitive practice. It's that if you're not taking charge of your brain, it's actually going to be sculpted by some of the forces around us. And with Facebook and social media, this is a really serious thing to consider. In terms of what I've noticed in the work that I've done, I think that there's a lot of research around particularly mental health and mindfulness. We know that these mental practices are really, really beneficial for things like ADHD, which is problems with focus and attention, both in kids and adults. And also, interestingly, not only what we're doing with our attention externally, but what we're doing internally. So where is your attention? What kind of thoughts are you resting your attention on for most of the day? Yep. Because in things like anxiety and depression, this is a mind that can be completely sort of consumed by these self-absorbed, negative, hopeless thoughts. And if we don't have any training, then we're getting pulled into that vortex. With mindfulness, it gives us a skill that helps us become masters of our own mind rather than slaves. So we start to be able to redirect the attention. And in that process, through training the mind, we transform the brain.
So interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
So I did a talk this morning entitled WTF Are We Doing? And it's all around how I don't believe we're consciously walking into the future in the context of the way we're evolving and engaging with technology. Yeah, and I think technology is amazing. I think there's so many great opportunities with AI, but I don't, as I said, I don't think we're consciously walking into it, and I don't think we're overlaying the ethical piece. And we spoke a lot about anxiety and depression. A lot of the questions were around that. And I mean, I'm not a psychologist, you are. And someone raised a very interesting point, and I mean, I by no means have the answer to this. And they said that in regards to the anxiety and depression, it's an epidemic. I mean, I think it would be to class it as anything else would be an
absolutely is.
It's an epidemic, and they basically said, is it truly a problem to the scale that we think it is, or is it that anxiety has actually become trendy for people to use as a term, not in a as in people now, rather than say I'm worried about something, constantly now label it anxiety. And my point was that basically I think it's relative. So she was saying, well, what someone worrying about the bills, someone could now say that that's anxiety and they're an anxious person. And I said, but for some people, I think not being able to pay the bills would be anxiety for them. That's their baseline. But I'm interested in your perspectives too.
I think that when you're talking about the statistics that you hear about, like depression being the number one global burden of disease right now, I mean, the WHO predicted it would be the top by 2020, and it's even worse than that. And these statements are not based on people saying that they're a bit anxious about paying the bills. I mean, there's a very rigorous criteria that people have to fulfill to have an anxiety disorder or depression. People can say, I'm feeling a bit depressed. That's very different to major depressive disorder. So I think that there's no doubt that the mental health crisis is real. And I think that as Ray Kurzweil and all of these thinkers are telling us that the future is so rapid, we can't even get our minds around it. We don't think in that exponential way. And I think that this mental health crisis is really a reflection of the rapid changes and the fact that we're not onto it enough. We really need to, as I say, resource our inner selves to deal with the outer world.
So what's got you disturbed about the future?
I have a little girl now who's nearly 3, and I'm really disturbed about the world that she's coming into from a technological perspective. And I'm a great fan of technology. I love it. But I'm concerned that the people that are creating this technology are lacking in wisdom, and they have such a huge level of power and responsibility, yet don't have the wisdom to be intentional about what they're creating and the effects that it's having. So I'm pretty disturbed about the idea of young people and sort of technology and the intersection of those two things. And that's where I'm sitting at the moment. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. And it's already an issue. It's sort of like already for me, like about negotiating just screens and toddlers. I mean, it's very real, and I know that it's the world we're in. So I'm not of the kind to kind of avoid, because I think it's a force that is just happening. So there's no point kind of putting your head in the sand about it.
No.
I think part of it's probably about empowering children and having honest, open conversations about things. But that really does disturb me. And I think another thing that disturbs me, which I think is getting better, this is a little bit off the topic, but it's disturbing me that medicine is still so compartmentalized. Like, when is it going to become more integrated and system, the way of systems thinking? That really bothers me a lot.
So unpack that a bit more. So when you say compartmentalized, and what would you like to see change?
I would love, for example, to see public mental health have the capacity to, have nutrition as part of that. How is it possible that nutrition is just completely ignored? Just this more holistic, integrated understanding. I've been doing quite a lot of reading at the moment around nutrition. I'm just quite obsessed with that right now. And, we know certain things about gluten and how that affects mental health. And there's just so much out there. And having come from psychiatry myself, we learnt none of this, And so what I think is really interesting is people go to doctors these days, and with all respect to medicine and doctors, I think there's wonderful, thank God for Western medicine. But I think you have to be really careful what doctors you go to, because a lot of them are old school and just haven't caught up with the more latest research. So it's sort of our responsibility as patients to actually investigate and make sure you're going to doctors that are holistic and know cutting edge research.
Well, how many people are medicated now because of anxiety that I speak to that have not been given any alternative options? Yeah. So they've gone into the doctor and said, these are the symptoms, this is what I'm suffering with, and they walk out the door with a packet of pills. Like, seriously, I know so many people like this.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that there's not people out there that do need medication, but what I'm saying is there's, like you're talking about, there's so many other ways, that you can start to look at how you reduce that level of anxiety that don't require medication.
Absolutely. I mean, this is exactly why I do the work that I do, with Mindful in May and the Happiness Plan, because I was sensing that, people need an accessible, guided way to develop these tools. And each year after Mindful in May, I do a 6-month follow-up program now, because people are like, what happens after Mindful in May? I'm constantly just gobsmacked by the impact that this has. People talking about, went to my doctor, went to my psychologist, done your program. I'm actually now coming off my anxiety tablets,
Wow.
And obviously under support. Like, I'll never be telling people, I'm always very cautious. Don't just ditch your medication. But people are developing this sense of confidence and empowerment. They know how to use their minds and they can manage their anxiety, and it gives them these tools, and then they come off their medication and it's fine, and it completely, it bothers me that so many people have this lack of agency around their own health.
Oh, but not even around their own health. It's around how they operate in their day-to-day. The amount of people that I work with that don't feel like they're in control of what they've got going on. And it's like, we do have control over these things. You can choose what you spend your time doing. And, I started to see so much of it in my work, and I'm very passionate about going into schools, as you know. And recently I met with one of the principals of one of the most innovative grammar schools in, I would say, Victoria, in Melbourne. And she said to me, I think one of the most important things we need to teach now is self-accountability and self-control. And I was like, isn't that sad? Because there's so many people out there that don't feel they have the skills to be able to be self-accountable in the way that they manage and live their lives, and have self-control around how they regulate their interaction, be it with technology, with certain people, with certain environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, radical self-responsibility.
I love those. Did you just make that up?
Yeah.
I love that. So the last thing I want to ask you, as the mother of a young child, and also obviously as the person that's got radical self-accountability, what are you doing to future-proof your own happiness? How are you what tactics are you putting into place to make sure that you don't get swept up in all this busy noise?
One of them is, and some may judge this as ignorant, but I actually have stopped reading the newspaper. And
I did that like 12 months ago.
Yeah, I've stopped reading it. I know enough about Trump. I don't need to spend my days, in digesting that material. I know enough about that. I'm really intentional with what I absorb, what I take in.
Yep.
So I will read the occasional article to keep myself vaguely informed about what's going on in the world, but I just have more important things to do. I have important work to do in the world, and that takes up all of my time, and that makes me feel really like, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of negativity out there, but I know that I'm spending my time doing good and doing as much good as I can. So that's one thing that helps me. Just choosing what I'm ingesting as media really intentionally. And another thing is that just these intentional practices of mind, which I know you teach about as well, like gratitude practices, etc. But we just know that orientating the mind in these ways actually sculpts it, and through the process of neuroplasticity really transforms things. And even for those people that might be, listening, that are experiencing a really difficult time right now, you can still do this. You can still choose to see the gratitude, choose in these difficult circumstances to direct the mind in certain ways, and that's a mental discipline, you know. So I think the word mental discipline comes up for me. I've learned over the last number of decades, and you know, I recall before I had these mindfulness practices, my mind was wild, and it scares me to think that I just had no control over it, you know. And now when things happen that are stressful, I can feel within myself the increased resilience that I have because I know how to use my mind, and I'm not like this ship that's sailing and that's completely dependent on the weather. Like, I am solid on the inside, and so when the stress comes, I have inner tools to manage them. So I think in terms of future-proofing ourselves, I think, you know, we can't control what's going on out there and how things are rapidly developing, but we can do everything possible to develop inner tools to build that resilience to manage.
I love it. I'm going to ask you one final question because I'm really curious. You've got a 3-year-old. How are you going to introduce her to mindfulness? How do you do it with children? Because I think a lot of people would be really
so
interested.
I've already started. I've already started doing that, and it's a matter of experimentation. But, you know, one of the things I started when she was about 2 was just actually starting to get her to connect to this idea that she has a breath. Like, even bringing that into her awareness, right? Because that's really the first point of mindfulness. It's having an anchor within you to come back to as your center. So we do calm breathing. So I get her to put her hand on her belly, and we do calm breathing. And to my shock and surprise, it's actually working, because I've just been experimenting with it. And, you know, now when she has a tantrum, 1 out of 3 tantrums, she'll have the tantrum and then look at me, and I'll say calm breathing, and she puts her hand on her belly and starts breathing. So that's really exciting, you know. And I think, wow. If I would have had that level of education early on, what suffering and stress that would have saved me. So I think that's really powerful. The other one we do is it's belly buddies, which I didn't invent, but that's where we lie down and we put teddies on our bellies, and we just watch the teddy go up and down with the breath. And again, the point there is just starting to introduce the children to the fact that there is somewhere they can put their attention internally, so that when they're getting out of control emotionally, they can grounds them. I'm going to try that with my 7-year-old. Not the teddies, but I think the breathing thing. The breathing. Yeah.
Have you got it?
Can I add something there? Because something we haven't spoke about, which I think is really interesting. Mindfulness, the word that's thrown around all the time now, what I see is really sort of fundamentally, it's really a vehicle to greater emotional intelligence, you know? And so that's through what I'm doing with my daughter. It's not the breath, it's not the breath, but it's like the breath becomes a vehicle to greater emotional intelligence, so that she can start to recognize when she's got a big emotion or a small emotion, you know, the different, and even as adults, so many of us that don't have this kind of emotional intelligence, we don't recognize when we're having a big emotion. So how the hell are we going to be able to manage that? So the first step is awareness that you're in the midst of a big emotion. And with awareness then comes greater freedom in how you're managing the emotions.
Do you have any intentions to take what you do to children?
Possibly.
Fabulous. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. So great to chat.